You can?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
You are listening to the Black Jezebel Podcast, where we dismantle respectability politics and discuss its effects on Black women's everyday lives. I'm your host, TemaraToday, and I've studied Black women's sexuality for over a decade. You may be wondering, why the Black Jezebel? Well, historically, Jezebel has been a controlling image used to represent Black women's sexuality as hypersexualized and deviant. Even today, its lasting effects impact our relationships, our mental health, and our God given human right to pleasure. This stops now. Your erotic energy is your power. Let's reclaim it.
Good.
Uh-oh. Welcome back. Hey, y'all. It is your host, Dr. Tamara, today, back on another episode of the Black Jezebel Podcast. And I am so excited about this conversation we are going to be having today. We have an amazing guest, and we are really going to have a really good conversation. So grab your wine, grab your water, whatever you are compelled to for this episode, because we are really going to get into it. So today I am here with the wonderful Dr. LaWanda Hill. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but Dr. LaWanda Hill is, we met each other a few years ago because she actually graduated from the University of Houston as well. And as you all know, that is where I just recently completed my doctorate degree. And the interesting thing about Black women in psychology, it's a very small network. Have to continue to stay connected and lift each other up. But Dr. Hill is doing amazing work in California. And so thanks for coming on the show with us today. Dr. Hill, can you please introduce yourself to the people?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Number one, love that intro. It's so dope. Hey y'all. Hey, I'm Dr. LaWanda Hill. I'm a licensed psychologist and consultant and curator of transformative spaces. I currently I live in Los Angeles, but I am from Louisiana. My second home is Houston, Texas, very near and dear to my heart. But I am, shaking up problematic norms and having provocative and critical conversations out here in the West. For now, we'll see where that goes after I shake some stuff up.
Yes, I love the language of provocative norms and having critical conversations, right? Because
Hmm.
it's the difficulty in that space that I feel like a lot of times we have a very hard time navigating. And so, Dr. Hill recently, I will tag all of her business pages and her social media at the end of the show and on the page, but she recently posted something that I have been toying with for a very long time, this idea of vulnerability. And I said, you know what? This is the perfect time to have Dr. Hill on this show so we can really get into it because it's been coming up in so many different spaces, right? And I
Mm,
think the way in which we've been having the conversation has been missing some essential core pieces.
mm.
And so, first, I want us to get into kind of, from your perspective, because you know, we have this idea, and really, I feel like vulnerability is something that within the last 5 to 10 years, people are now starting to use the terminology a little bit more. And
Mm.
we'll credit Brene Brown for her work in the research of vulnerability. But from your perspective, as a Black woman, as a Southern Black woman, what
Mm.
is your definition of vulnerability?
Ooh, I love that question. We're gonna start right off. I think vulnerability in intimacy are hand in hand to me. And so I describe them as to be seen, to see, and to allow yourself to be known. I
Hmm.
think that is what I feel when I think about vulnerability. And I think it is the pathway to anything good and amazing we want in life. And I know that may feel like what, but I fundamentally believe what we want the better versions of ourselves, the intimate relationships, the thriving relationships, the ease, the all the things that we've been talking about as of late require some level of vulnerability. And so I think it is the capacity to allow yourself to be seen and to see other people and allow yourself to be known in very intimate ways.
Hmm. And you said something that I want us to like tease through a little bit when we think about, because I feel like a lot of times people use the terms vulnerability and intimacy interchangeably,
Mm,
and I want us to talk a little bit about the relationship of the two,
mm-hmm,
right? Because
mm-hmm.
when we think about, because the way you just described vulnerability, what I was hearing was humanness, right? Right?
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
a very important aspect because and as we'll get into the difficulties of allowing ourselves to be human and how that shows
Mm,
up especially as black and brown bodies, right?
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
when we think about intimacy, a lot of times people have a very difficult time separating sex from intimacy,
I was
right?
on, yeah,
And
uh-huh.
so like how is that relationship, or how would you define that relationship, kind of the ebbs and flows of vulnerability as it relates to intimacy?
Think of it like this is in terms of a metaphor. I think that vulnerability is the pathway to achieving intimacy. I
Mm,
don't think that in intimacy, right? There could be physical intimacy, there's emotional intimacy, there's sexual intimacy, there's all these different levels of intimacy where you allow yourself to connect with another human being, but you cannot achieve it, I don't think, unless you're vulnerable. So I see it as the pathway to intimacy. I see it as an enhancement of
mhm,
intimacy, especially sexual intimacy.
mhm.
Because I do think that we're just wired. I think we're hardwired. And unfortunately, you mentioned black and brown bodies and thinking about vulnerability in this terms of being human. I don't think I know we haven't had permission to be
Yeah.
human historically, and that intergenerational norms, trauma, patterns, whatever you want to call them, all the above, has made it difficult for us to lean into that humanness. But with the movement of normalizing it, right? Because once upon a time it was cool to be the strong black woman because you had to be a strong black
Yes.
woman, which is in part of that script is to be invulnerable,
Yes.
right? Is to not show any weakness, if you will, any emotions, any challenges, any difficulty. And we adopted that, and that was survival. And then now we see that that was a survival tool, but it stands in the way of the things that we need to be able to thrive. Yeah, sure, some people I don't think can manage and handle your vulnerability, but some people can. So I think we just have so many complexities in our history and our current that make it hard for us to be vulnerable to achieve intimacy.
Y'all just go ahead and welcome the new co-host of Black Jezebel, because Dr. Hill just went on ahead and read all of my mind in the next in the next steps of what I was gonna get into, right? When we think about what has gotten in the way, when we think about the
Mm,
challenges and the dangers of vulnerability. Um,
yeah.
Last year I finished reading Tarana Burke's and Brene Brown's "You Are Your Best Thing."
Mm,
Vulnerability, shame, resiliency, and the Black experience. And
I gotta check that out.
oh my God, there are so many gems. It's an anthology, so there's so many different gems and
Mm,
pieces that that was shared. But this one passage that I wanted to that really speaks to exactly all of the things that you just said, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit with you when we think about why it has been so historically difficult to for us as black and brown bodies, but specifically as black women,
yeah,
really
yeah.
touched on this, and I thought that it would just be, you know, just a gem to share. So this was a essay by Tracy Michael Lewis called "Love Lifted Me: Subverting
Mm,
Shame Narratives and Legitimizing Vulnerability as a Mechanism for Healing Women in the Black Church." And you know, this is interesting because we're both from the South, we're both from Louisiana, so there is this inherent rooting of respectability politics in the way
mm-hmm,
that our developments has been nurtured specifically in Southern culture, right?
mm-hmm,
So this speaks to that. This speaks to how Black women and specifically Southern Black women, had to learn how to navigate in a system of where power was governed
Yeah.
based off of the church. And she writes, for these Black church women, standing bold in their truth and being freely vulnerable was the purview of rich white women who had the privilege of both fearlessness and tears.
Mm,
In addition to tampering down our intelligence and sexuality, these women were not supposed to cry about any of it. To deal, we were only supposed to sneak sips of cognac from the flask held in our bosoms, or maybe take an extra one of those white pills with the number 10 on the back, or
mm,
stuff our faces with a three-piece dark chicken and white bread with extra hot sauce. We were
mm,
supposed to do whatever it took to silence that part of ourselves that wanted both Jesus and liberty. There
mm,
was no room for mourning in the station in life
mm.
we accepted, and any additional expression of our pain was a sign of weakness or rebellion. So we saved our tears for high worship because at least then we knew
Mm.
God could bottle them up.
Damn.
Child, when I read that, I threw the whole book.
Lord, now listen, that right there, preach. That hits at a lot of nuances. I hear the intersection of sexism and racism and oppressive theology and the lack of humanity and how there was no space. And if that's what people modeled.
Yes,
That's what our parents modeled. No wonder it's hard for us to be human. We didn't have a place to be human because people still fundamentally see black people as inhuman, especially
yes,
black women.
yes. And and the pain there, right? The pain in her saying, like, not only was I not able to be vulnerable or share in that space, but I had to create a different way of coping
Yeah.
because my reality was still what it was, right?
Yeah,
Like I
food,
couldn't do that.
drugs, alcohol. Yeah, yeah,
And it's so familiar even now.
yeah, yeah,
It's so familiar even now. And so when we think about the difficulties and the challenges of what it looks like to be vulnerable as a Black woman, what that looks like,
mm,
you have to be able to honor that generational trauma that is embedded in even
yeah,
how we think about vulnerability, right? That was
yeah, yeah,
privilege.
yeah. And I think you have to honor. If I would take it a few steps back, I would say you have to honor how uncomfortable and scary it feels. You
Hmm.
know, like I think. And I don't necessarily relate in the sense of vulnerability, but I can definitely relate in the sense of abundance and wealth. I think that when you grow up with anything that is the opposite of what you're experiencing, you normalize it, right? So lack and scarcity and struggle feels very normal, even though it's hard. And after a while, this is why people can sometimes, not always, but this is a piece of the portion, I should say, of why people get stuck in patterns. It's familiar. It's comfortable, even in its discomfort, and you know it, and right, and so you grow up in that all the time. Everybody around you doing that, and so then all of a sudden, that pivots and switches to abundance, and wealth and all these other things, and it feels like, whoa, this is uncomfortable. And we all respond differently to discomfort. I think that vulnerability is the same way. I think that if you have, for whatever reason, despite being in the South and despite watching a mom, I don't think that modeled vulnerability. I think the only emotion she modeled was anger, probably a disappointment. Um, for some reason, I missed that train, and I was like, y'all gonna let me be vulnerable. Everybody gonna see my humanness, and they gonna know how I feel. But I do realize that in other for other people, sometimes it's like I don't even this don't even feel right. So if it don't feel right or this is uncomfortable, I don't want to do it, and it's scary. So yes, there's an intergenerational piece to it, but then the practicality when we start getting to the nuts and bolts of it, it's uncomfortable as hell for people.
Hmm. And it makes me think about like when we mostly see our most distress in our relationships, right? When we grow up, because
Mm,
as a child, you're just doing what you need to do to survive.
mm-hmm.
You have, in most cases, you don't even have the language to say
Mm,
something is right or wrong or
mm,
traumatizing or this is going to impact me in 20 years. You don't know any of that, right? So you're just
mm-hmm.
doing what you need to survive. But it makes us think that, wow, a lot of this distress is showing up as an adult when we are in these situations that are requiring us
Yeah.
to need to be seen in a way
Yep.
or need to be heard in a way that we've
Mm-hmm.
never had. And so it makes
Mm-hmm.
me think of, in full disclosure, I probably have mentioned this on a show before, that like growing up with a single mom who was also a professional woman, right? Who so
Mm,
didn't have the space in the room to say,
mm,
okay, well, I'm going to, take off my strong black woman cap, right? We
mm,
talked about
mm-hmm.
that had being worn as a badge of honor,
Yeah.
right? Not having the flexibility to do that, despite I have four sisters. So we grew up in a household, it's all women. That
Mm,
vulnerability was still not present, right? So it
mm,
wasn't an inherent thing. So it was not a norm for me to hear my mom say, I love you. Right.
mm,
So then how, and I mean like never,
mm,
never, when you fall and you cry and you scrape your leg, or, something,
mm,
you have your first heartbreak, or,
mm.
or it's just Tuesday and you want a hug. You want,
Right, 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 right. Because you just want one. You just
because you
feel
just,
it, you know?
because you just want the verbal affirmation that, like,
Yeah.
yes, a lot of times we grew up in households where people say, I don't have to tell you, I'm going to show you how I love you, and I show you how
Mm,
I provided for you.
yeah. Yeah.
How hard, like, how does that show up for us in our relationships, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We've been
Yeah.
in these relationships where it's just like, either it could be two different ways. Either we lean into the first person that does say, hey, I love
Mm,
you, like that, and we're
mm-hmm.
like, well, this must be the end all be all, right? Because this person they really must truly feel it because they're telling me it, right?
Yeah.
Or we push back and say, well, something must be wrong with you for
Yep, yep,
being
but we don't want it.
overly expressive, and
Mm-hmm.
I have to self protect, or I have to isolate.
Mm-hmm.
How have you seen that in your practice,
Mm-hmm.
exclusively working with, high functioning Black and Brown people?
I think that's a really, really good question. I'm trying to think if I'm thinking about how do they usually function. So majority of my women are black women. They are leaders, either leaders of their homes, leaders of their community, they're either activists or, you know, state public officials or like executives, VPs or what have you. And so I say that just to give you an idea of part of what their schema may be about if and when and how they can be vulnerable
Hmm.
because so often we have very white dominant norms about leadership
Yes.
that feels very objective, rational, non-emotional, very individualistic, non-collaborative. And so I think a lot of my women, because of the way they've been socialized and because most times they are the only or the few at the table, can take on that paradigm, right? That I can't when I say things like, I think you should lead with vulnerable communication. Like, I think you should share how you feel to connect with this person that you're leading. Their response is, I can't show weakness, right? And so this idea that I think they've been conditioned to believe that to be vulnerable, to share how you feel, to share your disappointment, to share any emotions, or to communicate any impact, those two pieces specifically. This is how I'm feeling. This is how this is impacting me. This is what's hard for me. Is a weakness, and so it's not. I don't experience them as overly communicative or overly expressive, but under, right?
Right.
They don't do it because they don't think it's part of their role or part of their schema. Another piece of that puzzle I see in the ways it shows up is that they don't feel psychologically safe enough to do that.
Yes.
Because what we know in most corporate institutions that are white dominant norms, black folks in general, but black women specifically, our emotions can be weaponized
Yes.
against us, right? Whatever natural. If we are crying, it may be intimidating. If we are angry, it may be aggressive or volatile, right? And so to express to express emotion has some negative consequence or is not part of what we should do. So they are just like encapsulated by that. And so my experience has been trying to like shatter that misinformation, and to really trace back where does it come from. Because I'll tell you one thing, who gonna cry in a work environment is a white woman, period.
All
All
the
the time.
time.
And
All the
her
time.
tears can cause death, i.e., by the way, they just found that woman who was responsible for Emmett Till's murder.
Hmm.
And so I think it's like that. Everything around them, even maybe if it was modeled at home, at work is unacceptable. And then if it wasn't modeled at home, and especially at work, and I'm gonna lead these people, oh no, Dr. Hill, you talking crazy, you know? So it's been kind of like a self silencing. A lot of my women self silence. A lot of my women um, shut off, or what I think is more challenging, they're not in contact anymore with their emotions. So they don't even know where to start. They know they feel something. We may have started jokingly talking about I feel some type of way, but I think it's because we don't really know how we feel. So we say
Yes.
that, and it's become a cultural thing.
hmm And that isolation. So, like some of the things that you were speaking to directly made me think about the difference between emotional vulnerability and structural vulnerability, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, this idea of structural vulnerability being what we're talking about, kind of that there are inherent groups that likely experience some form of social misery, whether that's poverty, whether that's oppression, whether that is gender or racial biases, that has had an impact on not just their individual experience, but their collective experience as a whole. So
Mm-hmm.
there's these structural foundations around surrounding vulnerability that affect their ability to be emotionally
Yeah.
vulnerable,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's when we think about that aspect of like psychological safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
How can I express myself or even know the cues to pay attention to be able to
Mm.
be emotionally safe when I've
Mm-hmm.
always only seen vulnerability from a structural lens
Mm-hmm.
that is
Or if
Mhm.
I've seen, or there's because of past trauma, perhaps there's never a place to be safe. So they can't discern. They can't discern between this is a space where you can actually share with you what you need to say without psychological safety, feel the ability to express without fear of consequences,
Mhm.
or this is not a place to share without fear that there will be consequences. So I think that radar, because I argue that we fundamentally built with it. We are built to be vulnerable. When you want that hug, when you cry, before somebody tells you big girls don't cry, or big boys don't cry, or men don't cry,
Mhm.
or before somebody tells you, I don't have time, I'm showing you how I love you. Before you start getting those messages, you naturally want it. So we're hardwired that way. But the conditioning, that's what I offer people when it feels so hard to connect to. You're hardwired to do this. The conditioning has helped you turn it off, but anything learned can be unlearned. And so
Yeah.
we can turn it back on, but just know that what you're feeling is not the norm. It's the opposite. You know what I mean?
What you're feeling is a result of you having to feel like you were your own self protector,
Exactly.
right? and
Exactly.
and I think that the unlearning part, like one of the things that we talked about is like this shift, right? The shift from the strong black woman to the safetyness of softy, like what does
Yeah,
it look like
yeah.
to be able to lean into being soft?
Mm-hmm.
What does
Mm-hmm.
that look like when we meet? What is that? What do we mean when we say that as black women?
I love that question. So there, for people who maybe haven't heard it, there's a movement now, and there's not one person credited for it, I don't think, but people are talking about moving with ease, right, and being softer and practicing more vulnerability and having more vulnerable communication. And I think the best song that I can think of, if I can pull it up, that really outlines this for me is that song from Insecurities on the very last episode. I think it's by Soul. And she says, I'm a little softer. Fighting is exhausting. I'm a little wiser. I'm a little more tender. I think for me, moving with more softness means that we're not always in fight mode. We're not always in defense mode. We are allowing ourselves to get help. We are allowing ourselves to move with greater ease. Now, that said, I think that for so long, there's so many different things contributing to us being the bulldog, right? People hire Black women to be the girl with the attitude, the
Yes.
girl with the bulldog, the girl to come in and whip things into shape. I see this all the time with the Black women that I serve who are in CEOs, COO positions, and then they hire a white counterpart to be the good cop.
Yes.
You got good cop, bad cop. So you're reinforced professionally to be hard,
Mhm.
right? Generations from your family, you've been told you need to be tough and you need to be strong and you don't need to trust nobody, right? So you moving with skepticism, you're moving with vigilance or hypervigilance in some cases, or you're taking on all the energy for the work for yourself. Like I remember having a boyfriend one time, moving my whole apartment with my best friend, and he called me. He was like, my ex boyfriend. Like, LaWanda, did you move your whole apartment today? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, I feel some type of way that my girlfriend is out there moving her whole apartment, but I can do it by myself. Like, I
Yeah.
don't need any help. I don't need any strength. When you don't know now, this is a place where you didn't have any help, but now you do have help. So to me, the moving with the ease and the softness and the tenderness is, you know, I believe gender and our expression of gender can be a spectrum. I believe we all naturally have femininity and masculine energy. I do think that a lot of our feminine energy, specifically as Black women, we've been socialized to turn it down and to tap more into more of our masculine, tougher, resilient, harder energy. And I say this as a cis female, that for me, part of being softer is allowing more help, allowing more gentleness, and self-selecting out of spaces where I can't be my full feminine self because I got to be all these other things, but giving myself permission to not have to show up in that way. I think that's the movement. I think that there's a discrepancy, which I think we're going to talk about and how we get there.
Right.
But I do think that at least our minds have changed. That I remember asking the client one time. I said, "Do you want to be softer?" And she said that question ate me up for 3 weeks.
Hmm.
She's like, "Cause I do. I just need permission."
Yes.
I just need permission. So I think that's a piece of it.
And I think part of the move is how do we give ourselves that permission? And one of the things that I think we have to first do is the awareness piece, right?
Yeah.
Like even just being aware that we have been socialized to
Yeah.
move in this way, right? Like that's a big
Yeah.
piece because when you think about this systematic oppression and systematic vulnerability, like what did that actually look like? That looked like the
Mm.
strategic removal of Black men from the household. That
Mhm.
looks like the strategic, you know, um, labels placed on Black women in order to control their sexuality, in order
Mhm.
to control their mothering and their parenting and their love expression, right?
Mhm.
Because that's what survival looked like at that
Mhm.
time. But part of the awareness is saying, where am I now?
Mhm.
Right? Like, where am I now, today, in this moment, in this body? Do I still
Mhm.
need to be adapting that mentality of survivalness, right?
Mhm.
Survivalship. How do I determine what is safe versus what's not safe? And I think one of the big pieces is like we have a hard time trusting ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, we've been conditioned not to. I think a piece of it is asking yourself, do I even want? Because even if you're still in it, I think you can ask yourself, do I want this? Like, I
Hmm.
don't want this no more. I don't want to be hard no more. I don't want to. This is my experience when I was at Stanford. I was at Stanford for about 3 years, and I did very well there. A lot of people were shocked when I decided to leave, but it's because I had to fight every fucking day. Every day I got to fight. Like, and when I mean fight, I mean defend. Defend blackness or call out microaggressions or challenge people to be more culturally sensitive clinicians. Like, I gotta put my energy in. It got to the point where it was like, I don't think I should be having to show up like this every day. Like, I gotta show up. My fight or flight is activated every day. That means I've been traumatized in this space. That means if I continue to show up in fight mode, that means I'm operating from a survival perspective. I don't want it. I'm in a survival state of being. I don't want it. And guess what? I want to self-select out of this. So I
Hmm.
think part of the self-awareness is realizing I used to be a little softer. I used to have more ease. I used to not have my stress response activated all day. I used to be more polite, more kinder, more gentle because I wasn't dealing with all these emotional wounds. And now I'm changing,
Hmm.
and I'm feeling different. And I don't have as much patience and I don't have as much empathy. And I have compassion fatigue and I don't give a fuck about anything. And so part of that means I want something different. Do I
Yeah.
want to act? Do I want to be this way? I don't. So what do I need to do? I think that's the first question.
And I think that's a really important question and something that we typically don't ask ourselves in the context of work relationships, right? That's
Mm.
a question that we normally ask ourselves in the context of romantic relationships,
Yeah, that's
right?
good. That's good.
Do
Mhm.
do I want
Mhm.
do I want to stay here, right? And I
Mm.
think that that makes it more challenging because we aren't honoring all of the pieces and ways in which we need vulnerability, right?
Mhm.
All
Mhm.
of the nuances of what that looks like. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you are able to decipher between like when it is safe enough to start
Mm-hmm.
that journey of start questioning when
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability is okay.
Well, I'm gonna probably give a hard answer. I think vulnerability requires risk. I don't think we always know. I think that my approach and the ways in which I, coach clients is I think people will show you there's an internal clock I think we have if we haven't been conditioned to turn it off to know when do I feel my freest? Like
Mm,
when do I feel unfiltered, unscripted? Like I just feel joy and like, oh, I like that. I think that intuition tells us something about this is probably safe, right? And so I think that we begin to test out how safe that is by how we show up. If
yes.
we share our true feelings, if we share our fears, if we share, something we're ashamed of, and people's response to us will let us, if they handle it with care, right? If they are careful with it, if they are supportive, if they're kind, if they're affirming, even corrective, but in a way that's not damaging, then we say, oh, this is a person I can continue to show up. I don't
Yes.
believe that we go out there full fledged and be, I think that there's tiers to this. And to me, my most intimate, deepest, although people probably would know this, but the most intimate things I think you share with people on different levels. I think they show you, that they have the capacity to handle your vulnerability. And I use those words very carefully because I think sometimes if we feel like you need to prove to me, you still in defense mode. I think.
Yes.
So I
Oh,
think it's more, how do we assess people's capacity to hold our emotions and our vulnerability? So for me, I tell people it's a win-win. It's risky because risky in the sense that they can mishandle it, or they can make you feel bad and they can create an emotional scar. But at least I know. At least I know, and I know how you make me feel, and I know when I feel this, I can't be vulnerable. When I feel this, I can be vulnerable. So I think to me, it's risky.
hmm.
It's gonna always be risky.
You
Most great
know,
things in life are.
right. And because of that, it also seems imperative to the healing process.
Absolutely, absolutely, because and this is why I say to the people, there's skills and tools to help you manage people's mishandling of your vulnerability. My dad passed away in 2011, but my dad was very invulnerable, and most of my scars came from like trying to be vulnerable with him and him rejecting it. And
Mhm.
so, just because he rejected it and it created some wounds, don't mean I can't heal those wounds. I think we get stuck there. I think we get stuck at the fear. What happens if they have a scar? And I'm not minimizing it to say that it's not traumatizing or damaging, but there are tools to help me manage the fact that I shared with somebody something really deep and they judged me and made me feel shame from that. Well, I have a community and I have a therapist and I have tools to help me move through that emotion so that I don't get stuck there. I think we don't see on the other side of what could potentially go wrong with vulnerability.
Yeah. And I think you also, made a really good point about like how we trust ourselves through this process because there are signs, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability is a two-way street, right? So there are signs
Mm-hmm.
that people show you and how they show up on whether or not they have the capacity to be able to hold that space for you. So those signs
Mm-hmm.
are, has there been any trust building between you and this
Mm-hmm.
other person, right? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
has that looked like? One of the things that you mentioned is like, do I feel like when do I feel my freest? Because that gives me a sign that that's probably safe, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
probably a safe space if I feel free and unrestricted, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think another sign is really important is like the empathy aspect. Has this person been able to exhibit any types of empathy towards
Mm-hmm.
me or to other people? Like, even if I haven't personally seen it for myself, have I
Mm-hmm.
seen it in other
Mm-hmm.
demonstrations of empathy towards other people,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that piece of like self agency in it, right? Like, how do I lean into this to trust myself enough as a guide of like knowing that even despite all of the signs, it's still gonna be scary, right? Like you're doing something new and uncomfortable, right? So what does it
Yeah.
look like to be able to move through that discomfort,
Because I
right?
think that's a good point. Those signs may feel similar at the beginning, And what I mean by that is discomfort and trauma response may feel the same. So you may not be able to distinguish between if this is safe or if I'm just anxious, like if this is unsafe or if I'm anxious.
Mhm.
I remember my therapist telling me something very similar to that. She's like, excitement can be a mixed emotion for me, just because what it's been associated with it is mostly been associated with death of somebody. And so at the beginning of excitement, it's like, oh shit, I paired it. That's what happened with conditioning. You pair this reaction with something else. And so as I was unlearning that, part of what she shared with me is that, in the beginning that may be harder for you to discern and decipher, but you'll get better at picking it up. You'll get better at trusting yourself. So I think that when you're being vulnerable, especially if you've had a trauma history, especially if you've been harmed, I think initially it may be hard to discern, is this just me being uncomfortable or does this mean that this person isn't psychologically safe? And so
Mhm.
I want to honor that is challenging at the beginning, but I also want to offer encouragement that the more, just like anything, the more we do it, the more we practice it, the better we get at building up that emotional intelligence to determine.
Mhm. It makes me think of kind of that. I one of my therapists um told me a while ago, kind of like, how we think about intensity in relationships
Mm,
and thinking that, like, oh, if they are intense, then that means that they love me so much more, right?
yeah, yeah.
But that's because of the familiarity of
Mm-hmm.
that intensity that we've paired with love
Mm-hmm.
from our early relationships. And so
Mm-hmm.
the unlearning of, like, actually, I can have a relationship that is peaceful, right? Like, we don't
Right.
have to be arguing and screaming at the top of our lungs, right? Like,
Yeah.
and allowing yourself to accept that and also realize that you deserve that too.
Yeah.
You
Uh-huh.
know, that it
Yeah.
is like the softness that when you ask yourself those questions of like, this, I'm tired, right? I've been holding
I
all of
don't
this.
want to fight. Listen, I want you, and I'm being very clear. I'm a sis. I've become more in touch with my femininity over the years because I mean, I used to be socialized to show up pretty masculine at work, just because I think I have a different energy professionally than I do in, we all have different kinds of relationships. So in romantic relationships, that masculine energy could carry over, and I have to remember, oh shit, I'm not fighting white toxicity today. I want to be dainty and I want to be cared for and I want you to appreciate all of this femininity, not in a toxic hyper masculinity way, but in a way that is a good match to my femininity. And if I'm tired of, I don't want to fight. I don't want to curse you out. I don't want to fight. I don't want to go back and forth. I want you to think I'm so delicate that I
Right.
can even open the door by myself. And I know some people hate that shit, but I'm like,
Look,
they need to be like, oh, that's too much for my girl to do. I'm opening the
please,
door for her.
please, please handle me with care.
Handle me
Do
with
I
care. That's a perfect description. Handle me with the care and fragility. No, I hate that word. That fragility is associated with white fragility, but handle me with care and sensitivity.
Yes, yes. And almost, I think that when you think about vulnerability from the lens of having past experiences of trauma, I remember reading something, a quote of describing it as like, because you've already had this experience with trauma and you've had all of this pain, it's almost like you are carrying around these broken pieces. Right. And so
Mm,
you're carrying
mm,
around all these broken pieces. And so part of the fear of being vulnerable is, how am I going to give somebody else these broken pieces? Because it's not a home.
oh,
So how am
yeah,
I going to
yeah.
hand over these broken pieces to them and say,
Mm,
okay, well, you figure this out, right? And so I think one of
mm,
the
mm.
like, and it really touched something for me because it made me think of this idea of like, you know, vulnerability, like, who is vulnerability for?
Mm,
Who is vulnerability for? And there's I think a lot of times a misconception that
mm,
vulnerability is for the other person.
mm, mm.
Would you argue that vulnerability is for yourself?
Hmm. I think vulnerability is an internal process that benefits you, but also benefits the other person. I think that's the way I would say it because when you said we're walking around with these broken pieces and how do I give it over to somebody, my immediate thought is that you don't. Vulnerability is saying that these are some broken pieces, and there's going to be tons of relationships that are going to help me put them back together. I hope that part of what we do helps me put another piece. I hope it helps me put another piece together. Like, I think that we think vulnerability means you fixing me or you completing me, because those are messages too we've received from the church. But it's not. It's like, because I'm in relationship with you, and because I expose some of these pieces and you see some of the pieces, something you say may help me glue it back together. So yes, vulnerability is going to benefit me, but it's going to also benefit the person. I don't think it's just like pleasure. You know, pleasure to me is an inside job, but if it can be outsourced and you can enhance it, great. And I think I see similarly the vulnerability in that, like, it's always for us. I think, but because we are so interdependent and we're so, I think, collectivist as people, naturally my vulnerability is going to help you connect with me in some type of way that's going to enhance your life. I
Yes.
don't even know, right? In ways I may or may not even know.
And that's also going to demonstrate that it's possible, right?
Exactly.
It's going to demonstrate that, hey, I'm doing this scary thing. I'm
Yeah.
inviting you to do it with me too, right?
Mhm.
Like I'm doing it. It's scary. I can even name that, hey, this is a scary thing for me, right?
Mhm.
But even moving past that is inviting the other person to say, well, damn, shit, I wouldn't have never really said that out loud, but
Mhm.
she didn't say
She
it.
said it, so let me
Hello.
do it. Right.
Okay, so I guess even if I gotta start with the whisper, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it is okay because we're demonstrating
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
in a way that's inviting,
Mhm.
this communal healing. I mentioned something last week on the episode. It's like we have this idea of isolation that, we have to heal in isolation. And when
Mm-mm.
we talk about vulnerability, like,
Mm-mm.
the pain did not happen in isolation.
Especially black folks. I don't know a black person who ain't experienced some level of trauma living in these great United States of America. And
Yeah,
so our collective healing from this collective trauma is a collective effort.
yeah,
Fundamentally believe that. And white, listen, y'all, that's not ours. White supremacy, individuality, isolation, healing, that's not our culture. We may have been conditioned to think that's our culture. That's not our culture. We've always been collectivists before we return, stripped from our tribes. And we're still a collective. Even if we have great divisions, we have to overcome to
yeah.
get there. And so I want to disrupt that narrative that has to happen in silence. Or I believe in the context of relationships, we can experience the greatest healing. Yes, we can experience the greatest pain, but we can also experience the greatest healing.
Yes, absolutely. I 1,000% believe that we have to be more intentional about
Mm-hmm.
disrupting that narrative. And it makes me also think of, how you described vulnerability at the beginning of the show, the willingness to be seen and the
Mm-hmm.
desire to be heard, and how
Mm-hmm.
how we talk about that being, instrumental to our own healing, right?
Yeah.
If I'm saying like, hey, I've gotten to a point in my healing where I believe that my voice is important, right? I
Yeah.
believe that my experience is worthy. And so me allowing myself the opportunity to be vulnerable and saying, no, I do need to be seen, and I do need to be
Mm-hmm.
allowing your healing to go to a deeper level than it would have been. Had
And then we can thrive.
hello,
Then we can really
yes,
experience the thriving, because now I'm only being in relationships with people that value my voice, that can handle my vulnerability. I'm only accepting positions that I can be human at, right? I'm only, moving in spaces that see my humanity and value my humanity. And that's the thriving. I think that's the abundance we was created to have. But we can't experience so much and so often because of all of the work that we haven't done. So we're experiencing things, and I think that's a human experience. We all have to go through different levels of healing. But I think that that's what thriving can take place. When I can really appreciate all the things that make life enriching and fulfilling.
yes. And I think it requires you to ask, the question of what you want your healing to look like and what you want it to feel like in your body, right? Because,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that, if you've been operating from a system of survival for so long, maybe you don't even know what thriving looks like and feels like, and
No.
how to recognize this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Dr. Amanda Long and I, her, we were talking about this on my show. We were talking about LaWanda Hill. We were talking about how that pathway from survival to thriving is a step process. It's a phased approach. And I prayed this prayer before, like, Lord, let me become more comfortable with ease. Now I'm comfortable with it. Now I'm like, oh, it's too hard. But there was once upon a time that I was very uncomfortable with anything that wasn't hard. And it's amazing how God works. I remember listening to it, watching a Beyonce documentary, and she said, I respect things that take work. And I told my therapist, I was like, because I respect things that take work. She said, you respect challenges, not like hardship and suffering. There's a distinction. And so I'm like, that, because you get to a place where you feel like if it ain't suffering, must not be good, must not be sustainable. And so I think it's okay to honor that's vulnerable, to say, this ain't always been comfortable for me to be at ease. It ain't always been comfortable for me to live in abundance. It hasn't always been comfortable for me to, be with someone who's tender. But I realize that that's part of the process. And, whatever you do, whatever your spirituality is, to ask for comfort in that, like to give yourself permission to ease into comfort with that emotion of thriving is work. And I will personally attest to that has been my journey. Like thriving, what you would think it would be easy. It was not easy. It was a process. It's still a process.
Yeah, and I think, thanks for sharing that because, it reminds us that we all of our journeys look very different. All
Mm-hmm.
of our journeys have different obstacles. And I think, especially when you are always surrounded by high professional achieving people,
Mm-hmm.
there's this sense of like, well, if I'm not doing 15,000 million things, then I must not be,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
reaching my fullest potential. I must not be really being successful.
Mm-hmm.
And we're
Mm-hmm.
not honoring like the healing aspect of rest, right? We're not
Yeah.
we're not
Yeah.
honoring the what does it look like to be able to enjoy the
Yeah.
process, right?
Yeah, yeah. That takes some paradigm shifts, y'all. Listen, you could not tell me, and it may sound crazy to y'all, but it was my real reality. This is what took me back to therapy. You could not tell me that my success was not equated to debt.
Mm.
Every message that I've ever gotten from the church, I will say, made that pairing so strong for me that I had to work to disentangle it. Like, and I'm like, everybody else ain't feeling like this. People out here like, girl, no, success, that ain't the same, but that's been my journey. And so shout out to my therapist, Dr. T, for helping me with that. But we just, I just wanted to underscore that fact that we all have different challenges on our journey that we have to be able to be vulnerable enough to say, wait, I don't think I'm supposed to be experiencing it like this. I think I'm supposed to be being more comfortable with this success and I'm not. So what does that mean?
What does that look like? Yeah, I think that that's such an important piece, and it brings me to the point in our show where we share a Black Jezebel moment. And so, this is an opportunity where is usually centered around the show topic. And so today we've been diving all into vulnerability, and so it's an opportunity for you to reflect on a moment where you felt that I understand why this is important for me. I understand, and I'm moving into a place where I can show
Mm,
up in my full self. And so I would like,
mm.
if you would like to share, Dr. LaWanda Hill, do you have a Black Jezebel moment around
How
vulnerability?
many do I have? Absolutely. Absolutely. I have so many moments. I remember talking to my accountant and she asked me, what you gonna do with your first million? And I remember feeling so anxious and overwhelmed by that question that I was like, I got to do the work. Because there's no way I'm going to be a millionaire, anxious as fuck, and not on somebody's yacht somewhere living the life. And she said to me, because she also is licensed and ordained, she's like, we wonder, he came that we may have life in abundance. This is part of the life. And so for me, it's like you are being robbed of joy. You are being robbed of the hard work your ancestors put in. My ancestors could not dream. I am their wildest dream, probably. And so it's like, what was it for if you're just going to be in this survival, anxious, uncomfortable space? And so there was this discrepancy between where I knew I needed to be and the emotions I was feeling. And I remember, if y'all can see my office, I had sticky tabs because throughout the day these things will come up.
Mhm.
It may not be in that question. It may be, oh, I don't want to work no more today. So I'm like, oh, ooh, am I supposed to not be struggling? And I'd have these sticky tabs. It's okay to not struggle, you
Mhm.
know, or it's okay to have abundance. Life is abundant. I would have these different thought processes that were different from my innate reaction. Until then, I could take that one down, and I could take that one down, and I ain't need that one no more. And then I was like, all right, so what we gonna do with a multi-million? Like then,
Right.
then it just happened. So it was but it was scary as fuck. It was very anxiety. I still get emotional thinking about it. It was very anxiety provoking. You don't feel it's supposed to be that easy. You don't feel you feel something's wrong. It's unfamiliar, and in that moment, it's also sad because you realize how your life has painted that picture.
Yes.
That some people, and I work with Stanford students, so some people come out the womb expecting the life that we work so hard to work for, and so the stark difference between what was expected and what I don't feel is I deserve was just glaring to me. And
Mm.
so, it was like I'm gonna get to that place. I ain't gonna be elite and pompous, but I'm gonna get to that place where I expect the same level of abundance that you expect.
Yes, amen. I mean, that's so important, like being able to lean into that. This is what was painted for me, but this does not have to be my reality. And it's
Mhm.
okay for me to lean into that. And when I think
Mhm.
about my Black Jezebel moment around vulnerability, I was kind of reminded about this when you talked about your move, because recently I just packed up all my stuff and moved from San Antonio to Dallas. And I remember being in a place where so much was happening in such a short amount of time. And I had to have
Mm.
like a major surgery, and I had to pack up my whole apartment, and I had to figure out how I was going to get everything to Dallas, and the movers kind of canceled on me like the day before the move. And so
Mhm.
it was a place where I had to be like, I need help, right?
Mm.
I,
Mm.
the one thing that I don't like asking for, like, I need help. I was in no
Mm.
position to like not need
Mhm.
help. So I had to lean into this space of vulnerability of like, let me call everybody I know. And I need help. You know movers. Can you come help me pack? Can you, meet
Yeah.
and organize, movers for Dallas, and me having to put my pride aside and say,
Mm.
why do you feel like you have to do this alone?
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
this, like you don't have to do this alone. You have people that love you.
Yep.
You have friends, and and people that are showing up for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There, like you don't have to do this alone. So what's that narrative that you
Yeah.
figure it out, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it definitely made me think about that, and and encourage me to lean more into that
Mhm.
vulnerability and into that softness. So I thank you so much for
For
sharing that,
sure.
and this has just been such a treat. I mean, we could go on and on and on, and I want to be respectful of your time, and ask that you share with the people, how can they find you, how can
Yeah.
they connect with you, what are some services that you offer?
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time talking about vulnerability. I'm actually right now doing a workshop for Black women leaders, and that's at any level, whether you're entry level, mid, or senior. On I call it Executive Leadership Development Workshop, but it is teaching the soft skills, these very skills, practicing vulnerability, cultivating emotional intelligence, practicing critical conversations. Because what we didn't talk about is what happens when someone mishandles your vulnerability that you are in committed relationship with.
Mhm.
That's going to require a critical conversation. And so, as leaders, and as even if you're not leading necessarily professionally, that is a set of skills that I think is now getting more attention. But it's always, to me, been very critical for any and everybody is to have these emotional intelligence skills. So everybody can find me I'm Dr. LaWanda Hill on all platforms, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. My website is www.drlawandahill.com, and there you can find all the information on this workshop. What I do is we have cohorts of Black women who have similar narratives, similar but different struggles. So we work really hard to create a sense of psychological safety and begin to tear down some of these barriers, and then begin to actually teach and cultivate these skills, but in a community of Black women who get it. Because so often we can't do it in what my mama would call mixed company, because people can't relate to our plight.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
I really enjoy curating space for Black women to thrive by giving them the skills and the tools to be, emotionally vulnerable, to practice communication and practice boundaries, and to ultimately thrive.
Absolutely. I have so many names and faces of people that came to mind of very high powering, successful black women that could really take advantage of this.
Yes,
So
yes.
I'm excited that you're doing this, and I'm definitely going to share this information. I will link all of this information for Dr. LaWanda Hill in the show notes. So definitely, please reach out. Definitely take advantage of this. Um, if you have not, please go and subscribe for the Black Jezebel podcast. Share, like, listen, and comment. Also, don't forget that we will be presenting at Sex Down South next month.
Yeah,
I'm so
yeah.
excited. We will be there presenting in Atlanta. So definitely go to www.sexdownsouth.com and register. They are also doing virtual platform as well. So definitely get involved. If you can't go physically, you can show up for the virtual platform and support. So I'm looking forward for all of the people that are going to be joining me in Atlanta. We are talking about free the pussy, y'all. We have got to shed these respectability politics and step into our place
Free.
in a way that we deserve and that we need for our healing. So I'm really excited about that. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for joining us on this episode of the Black Jezebel
Yes. Thank you
Podcast.
for
This has
having
been
me.
healing. This has been a blessing. And any other last words that you'd like to leave with the audience?
Listen, black women deserve to thrive, but there's a lot of steps in between. So invest in the steps in between so that you can live your best life that your ancestors most often sacrifice a lot for.
Yes, yes, because the goal is to not just survive, but to thrive.
Thrive. There you
Okay.
go.
And you have to learn how to lean into that. So thank you so much. Thanks, guys, for listening. And until next time, bye, y'all.